So basically, I destroyed my golden child brother's entire life with one viral social media post. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but hear me out. My whole life, Marcus got everything while I got ignored. Perfect grades, perfect job, perfect girlfriend. At least that's what everyone thought. Turns out my brother was actually a drug-addicted gambling addict who owed dangerous people $80,000. When I tried to warn my family, they called me jealous. So I did what any digital marketing specialist would do. I made a comprehensive post with screenshots, videos, and financial records showing exactly who Marcus really was. Within 48 hours, it had 500,000 shares. His sponsors dropped him, local news picked it up, and his perfect reputation was completely destroyed. Some people think I went nuclear, but honestly, sometimes that's what it takes to get people to finally listen. So I'm Jordan, 26, digital marketing specialist. I work for this mid-sized agency downtown, mostly handling social media campaigns for local businesses. Nothing too exciting, but I'm good at what I do and the pay is decent. My family situation has always been pretty messed up though. I have this older brother Marcus who's basically been the golden child since we were kids. He's 28, works in sales for some tech company, and according to my parents, he can do absolutely no wrong. Meanwhile, I've been invisible my entire life. Growing up, Marcus got all the attention. When he brought home B's, my parents celebrated. When I brought home A's, they barely noticed. He got the newer car, the bigger bedroom, and basically everything handed to him. I learned early on that nothing I did would ever measure up to whatever Marcus was doing. The thing is, I never really minded being overlooked until recently. I had my own life, my own career, and honestly I was doing pretty well for myself. But over the past few months, something started bothering me about Marcus. He kept talking about money problems, asking my parents for loans, but then showing up with expensive stuff. My parents would always bail him out without question. Meanwhile, when I mentioned wanting to buy a new laptop for work, they told me I should save up for it myself. The double standard was getting ridiculous, but I figured that was just how things were in our family. What I didn't realize was that Marcus was hiding something way bigger than I ever imagined. And when I finally discovered what it was, everything changed. Friday evening rolled around, and I was dreading dinner at my parents' house like usual. These weekly family dinners were basically just opportunities for my parents to fawn over Marcus while I sat there like furniture. I got to their place around 6 and could already hear Marcus's voice booming from the dining room. He was telling some story about closing a big deal at work, and my parents were hanging on every word like he'd just cured cancer or something. My mom barely looked up when I walked in. She just pointed toward the kitchen and told me to grab the salad bowl. Meanwhile, Marcus got a huge hug and my dad immediately started asking about his latest business trip. During dinner, it was the usual show. Marcus talked about his promotion, his new client accounts, and how well everything was going. My parents were practically glowing with pride. When my mom asked what I'd been up to, I mentioned landing a major campaign for a restaurant chain, but she just nodded and turned right back to Marcus. The thing that really got me, though, was when Marcus started complaining about money again. He told my parents his rent was going up and he was struggling to make ends meet. My dad immediately offered to help with a loan, no questions asked. But here's what bothered me. Marcus was wearing this expensive watch I'd never seen before. Like, really expensive. The kind that costs more than most people make in 6 months. When I asked him about it, he just brushed it off and said it was a gift from his company. Then he started talking about needing to cut back on expenses, maybe move to a cheaper place. My parents were so sympathetic, talking about how hard it must be for someone as successful as him to deal with financial pressure. The whole time, this watch was practically glowing on his wrist. I tried to point out the contradiction, but my dad just gave me this look like I was being petty. He told me that successful people sometimes get nice things from work, and that I shouldn't be jealous of my brother's achievements. That's when something clicked for me. I work in marketing. I know when things don't add up. If Marcus was really struggling financially, why was he wearing a watch that probably cost more than my car? And why did my parents never question anything he said? After dinner, I hung around to help clean up while Marcus took off early. He said he had plans with friends, but something about the way he checked his phone constantly during dinner seemed off. He kept getting texts and would immediately put his phone face down on the table. My mom spent the entire cleanup time talking about how proud she was of Marcus and how well he was doing despite his temporary money troubles. She didn't ask a single question about my work or my life. Driving home that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with the whole situation. The expensive watch, the constant phone checking, the way he rushed out after dinner. None of it matched his story about struggling financially. I decided I needed to pay more attention to what Marcus was actually doing versus what he was telling everyone. Saturday afternoon, my mom called and asked if I wanted to come with her to drop off some leftovers at Marcus's apartment. Normally, I would have said no, but I was curious to see his place and maybe figure out what was going on with him. We got to his building around 2, and I was immediately surprised by how nice it was. This wasn't some struggling guy's apartment. This was a luxury complex downtown with a doorman and everything. The rent here had to be at least 3 times what I was paying. Marcus seemed nervous when we showed up. He kept us in the entryway and didn't offer to give us a tour or anything. When my mom asked to use his bathroom, he hesitated before pointing down the hall, but he followed her like he was worried about what she might see. While they were gone, I looked around his living room. Everything was expensive: leather furniture, huge TV, art on the walls that looked like it came from actual galleries. This definitely wasn't the apartment of someone having money troubles. Then I noticed something weird on his coffee table. There were 2 phones sitting there, his regular iPhone that I'd seen him use, and another phone I'd never seen before. When I heard footsteps coming back, I quickly moved away from the table. Marcus rushed over and casually swept both phones into his pocket, but not before I saw the second one light up with a text. The name on the screen was just with no last name. My mom was going on about how nice his place was, and Marcus was making excuses about how he'd gotten a good deal on the rent and most of the furniture was borrowed from friends. But I could see him getting more agitated as we stayed longer. When my mom went to look at some photos on his bookshelf, I pretended to check my own phone but was actually watching Marcus. He kept fidgeting with something in his jacket pocket, and I could see the outline of what looked like a small bag or envelope. Then his regular phone rang, and he answered it in front of us. He told whoever was calling that he was with family and couldn't talk, but he'd call back in an hour. The conversation was brief, but something about his tone seemed off, like he was being careful about what he said. After we left, my mom spent the whole drive home talking about how well Marcus was doing and how proud she was that he'd found such a nice place despite his financial difficulties. She said it just showed how resourceful and responsible he was. But I couldn't stop thinking about that second phone and the way Marcus had acted. Something was definitely going on, and it wasn't what he was telling our family. That evening, I decided to drive back to Marcus's building. I wasn't planning to do anything crazy, just maybe see if I could figure out what was going on. I parked across the street and waited. Around 9, I saw Marcus come out of the building. But instead of getting in his car, he walked to the corner and got into a different car, one I didn't recognize. Through the windshield, I could see him talking to someone, and it looked like he handed them something. The whole interaction lasted maybe 5 minutes. Then Marcus got out, and the other car drove away. He looked around nervously before going back into his building. I sat there for another hour, but nothing else happened. Still, what I'd seen was enough to confirm that Marcus was definitely hiding something from our family. Sunday morning, I couldn't get what I'd witnessed out of my head. I'm a digital marketing specialist. Research and investigation are literally part of my job. So I decided to do what I do best and dig deeper into Marcus's online presence. I started with his social media accounts. His Instagram was like a highlight reel of success. Photos from expensive restaurants, vacation shots from places I knew he couldn't afford, pictures with people who looked like they had serious money. Every post was carefully curated to show this perfect lifestyle. But when I looked closer at the details, things started getting weird. A lot of his recent photos were tagged at locations during times when I knew he was supposed to be at work. Some of the expensive items in his photos appeared and disappeared, like he was borrowing them just for pictures. Then I found his LinkedIn, which told a completely different story. According to his profile, he'd been promoted 3 times in the past year and was now some kind of senior account executive. But when I cross-referenced his company's website, his name didn't appear anywhere in their leadership section. I spent hours going through his posts, comments, and tagged photos. The more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. He was living at least 3 different versions of his life online, and none of them seemed to match reality. That's when I remembered something from yesterday. The way he'd been so careful about that phone call in front of us. I started thinking about that second phone and what it might be used for. I decided to take a different approach. Instead of just looking at his public social media, I started searching for any other accounts he might have. I used different combinations of his name, nicknames, and details I knew about him. After about 2 hours of searching, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a Twitter account under a slightly different version of his name, and the content was completely different from his other profiles. This account was full of complaints about money, references to debts, and interactions with accounts that were clearly involved in some kind of illegal activity. The tweets went back about 8 months, and they painted a picture of someone spiraling out of control. There were references to gambling losses, requests for loans from people with obviously fake names, and increasingly desperate messages about needing money fast. But the worst part was the replies to his tweets. People were making threats, talking about deadlines and consequences. One thread from just 2 weeks ago mentioned a specific amount, $80,000. I screenshotted everything I could find before the account potentially got deleted or locked down. Then I kept digging. Using some basic online investigation techniques I'd learned for work, I was able to find public records that showed Marcus had been evicted from 2 previous apartments in the past year. There were also court filings related to unpaid debts and at least one restraining order filed against him by a former roommate. The picture that was emerging was completely different from the successful, responsible person my parents thought they knew. Marcus wasn't just having temporary money troubles. He was in serious financial and legal trouble, and it had been going on for months. By Sunday evening, I had compiled a folder full of evidence showing that Marcus was living a complete lie. The question was what to do with this information. Monday morning, I called my parents and asked if they could meet me for coffee. I told them I had something important to discuss about Marcus, and I wanted to talk to them privately before things got worse. We met at this little cafe near their house around noon. I could tell they were already annoyed before I even started talking. My dad kept checking his watch, and my mom made some comment about hoping this wasn't going to be another complaint about Marcus getting more attention. I tried to ease into it by explaining that I was concerned about Marcus's behavior lately. I mentioned the expensive watch, the luxury apartment, and the inconsistencies between his claims about money troubles and his obvious spending. My mom immediately got defensive. She told me that Marcus worked hard and deserved nice things, and that maybe if I focused more on my own success instead of being jealous of my brother, I'd understand how business works. When I tried to show them some of the social media evidence I'd found, my dad cut me off. He said he didn't want to hear gossip or speculation, and that if I had real concerns about Marcus, I should talk to him directly instead of going behind his back. I explained that I thought Marcus might be in serious trouble, possibly involving illegal activities and dangerous people. I mentioned the second phone and the strange behavior I'd witnessed. That's when my mom really lost it. She accused me of making up stories to hurt Marcus because I was jealous of his success. She said I'd always been resentful and that this was just another example of me trying to tear down my brother. My dad was slightly more reasonable, but he still refused to consider that Marcus might be lying to them. He said that successful people often have complex financial situations that might look suspicious to someone who doesn't understand business. I was getting frustrated, so I decided to show them one of the screenshots from Marcus's secret Twitter account. It was a tweet from the previous week where he was clearly asking someone for money to pay off a debt. Before I could even explain what they were looking at, Marcus walked into the cafe. I don't know if it was a coincidence or if my parents had texted him, but his timing was perfect from his perspective. He immediately saw the tension at our table and asked what was going on. My parents explained that I'd been making accusations about him being involved in illegal activities and lying about his finances. Marcus looked hurt and disappointed, like he couldn't believe his own brother would say such things. He sat down and very calmly addressed each of my concerns. The expensive watch was a bonus from work. The apartment was a sublet he'd gotten through connections. The phone I'd seen was a work phone for client calls. Everything had a reasonable explanation. Then he turned it around on me. He told my parents that he'd been worried about me lately, that I seemed bitter and resentful about his success. He said he'd noticed me being more critical and negative during family dinners, and he was concerned about my mental state. My parents ate it up completely. By the end of the conversation, they were more worried about my jealousy issues than anything Marcus might be doing. He even offered to help me find a better job or maybe get some counseling to deal with my resentment. I left that meeting feeling completely defeated. Marcus had managed to turn everything around and make me look like the problem. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew he was lying. That's when I decided to take a different approach. Tuesday through Thursday, I took a different strategy. Instead of trying to convince my family with evidence they refused to believe, I decided to document everything myself. If I was going to expose Marcus, I needed proof that was so overwhelming that even my parents couldn't ignore it. I started by following Marcus more systematically. I took time off work and basically made investigating my brother into a full-time job. I know how that sounds, but I was convinced he was in serious danger and potentially putting our family at risk too. Wednesday morning, I followed him from his apartment to what was supposed to be his office. But instead of going to his company's building, he went to a parking garage downtown and met with the same person I'd seen him with on Saturday night. This time, I was prepared. I had my phone ready and managed to record part of their interaction from across the street. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I could clearly see Marcus handing over an envelope and the other person giving him what looked like a small package. The whole thing lasted about 10 minutes, but it was obviously some kind of transaction, and it definitely wasn't a business meeting. That afternoon, I decided to call Marcus's company directly. I pretended to be a potential client who had been referred to him specifically. The receptionist was confused and told me they didn't have anyone by that name working there. When I pressed for more information, she checked with someone else and came back to tell me that Marcus had actually been let go about 6 months ago. She couldn't give me details about why, but she confirmed that he was no longer employed there. So Marcus had been lying to our family about having a job for at least 6 months. That explained why he was always available during business hours and why he was constantly asking for money. Thursday, I decided to dig deeper into his financial situation. Using some of the information I'd gathered, I was able to find more court records and public filings. What I discovered was worse than I'd imagined. Marcus had been sued by at least 4 different creditors in the past year. There were judgments against him totaling over $60,000, and that was just the legal stuff I could find online. The Twitter account I'd found earlier suggested he owed even more to people who weren't going through the courts. I also found records showing that he'd been arrested twice in the past 8 months, once for public intoxication and once for possession of a controlled substance. Both cases had been dismissed or pleaded down, but it showed a pattern of increasingly risky behavior. But the most damning evidence came Thursday evening. I was sitting in my car outside a restaurant where I'd followed Marcus when I saw him meet with someone who was clearly a drug dealer. The interaction was obvious. Marcus handed over money and received a small bag in return. I managed to record the entire transaction on my phone. The video was clear enough to see both of their faces and the exchange of money for drugs. It was exactly the kind of evidence that would be impossible for Marcus to explain away. By Thursday night, I had compiled a comprehensive file of evidence showing that Marcus was unemployed, deeply in debt, involved with drug dealers, and had been lying to our family about every aspect of his life for months. The question was how to present this information in a way that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Friday morning, I made a decision that would change everything. As a digital marketing specialist, I knew the power of social media to spread information quickly and widely. If my family wouldn't listen to me privately, maybe they'd pay attention when the whole world could see the truth. I spent the morning creating what I called a comprehensive social media post that laid out everything I discovered about my brother's secret life. I included the screenshots from his fake Twitter account, photos of the court documents, the video of his drug transaction, and a detailed timeline of his lies. I was careful to present everything factually, without emotional language or personal attacks. I let the evidence speak for itself. The post was long, but I organized it clearly with headers and bullet points so people could easily follow the story. The most powerful part was the side-by-side comparison I created. On one side, I showed Marcus's public Instagram posts from the past month, expensive dinners, luxury items, business success stories. On the other side, I showed his secret Twitter posts from the same time period, desperate pleas for money, references to drug debts, and increasingly panicked messages about people threatening him. I also included screenshots of his LinkedIn profile claiming he'd been promoted multiple times at a company that had actually fired him 6 months ago. The contrast between his public persona and reality was stark. Before posting, I wrestled with whether this was the right thing to do. I knew it would destroy Marcus's reputation and probably end any chance of our family relationship recovering. But I also knew he was in serious trouble, and my parents' refusal to acknowledge reality was enabling his dangerous behavior. At 10 a.m. on Friday, I hit publish on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram simultaneously. I tagged several family members, including my parents, and used hashtags that would help the post get discovered by people in our city. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within the first hour, The post had been shared over 100 times. People were commenting with their own stories about Marcus. Apparently, I wasn't the only person he'd been lying to. Former coworkers confirmed he'd been fired. People from his apartment building talked about late-night disturbances and suspicious visitors, and several people mentioned that he owed them money. By noon, the post had gone viral locally. It was being shared in community groups, neighborhood forums, and local business networks. The video of Marcus's drug transaction was being viewed thousands of times. That's when the backlash started. Some family friends and distant relatives began commenting that I was being vindictive and that family problems should be handled privately. A few people accused me of fabricating evidence or taking things out of context. But for every negative comment, there were 5 more from people sharing their own experiences with Marcus or praising me for having the courage to expose the truth. The evidence was too comprehensive and well-documented for most people to dismiss. Around 2 p.m., my phone started ringing constantly. My parents called multiple times, but I let it go to voicemail. I could hear my mom crying in one message, begging me to take down the post and asking how I could do this to my own family. Marcus tried calling too, and when I didn't answer, he started sending increasingly frantic text messages. First, he tried to deny everything. Then he accused me of ruining his life. Then he begged me to remove the post and promised he would get help. But by then, it was too late. The post had been shared over 1,000 times and was spreading beyond our local community. Screenshots were being posted in other forums, and people were creating their own posts about it. The story had taken on a life of its own. By Saturday morning, the post had exploded beyond anything I could have imagined. It had been shared over 10,000 times, and local news outlets were starting to pick up the story. My phone was buzzing constantly with interview requests and messages from reporters. The first news story went live Saturday afternoon on a local blog that covered community issues. They'd done their own investigation and confirmed most of the details I'd revealed. They also found additional information I hadn't discovered, including the fact that Marcus had been banned from several local casinos for unpaid debts. That's when things really spiraled out of control for Marcus. His Instagram and LinkedIn accounts were flooded with comments from people who'd seen my post. He tried to delete the negative comments, but they were coming too fast. Eventually, he made all his accounts private, but by then screenshots of everything had been saved and were circulating independently. Sunday morning, a local TV news station ran a segment about the story. They interviewed several people who'd had business dealings with Marcus and confirmed that he'd misrepresented himself in multiple situations. The segment included clips from my original post and the video of his drug transaction. But the real damage came when his former sponsors started responding. Marcus had been doing some kind of influencer marketing for local businesses, promoting products and services on his social media accounts. Several companies issued statements distancing themselves from him and announcing that they were ending their partnerships. One restaurant owner gave an interview saying that Marcus had convinced them to give him free meals in exchange for social media promotion, but that he'd been lying about his follower count and engagement metrics. A clothing store said he'd taken merchandise on consignment and never paid for it. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd been running elaborate scams across multiple areas of his life. It wasn't just drugs and gambling. He'd been systematically lying to and stealing from dozens of people and businesses. By Sunday evening, my post had been shared over 50,000 times and had generated hundreds of news articles and blog posts. #MarcusFiles was trending locally on Twitter, and people were using it to share their own stories about encountering similar deception in their lives. My parents finally reached me Sunday night. My mom was devastated, crying and asking how I could have done this to the family. But my dad surprised me. He said that after seeing all the evidence and hearing from other people who'd been deceived by Marcus, he was starting to understand that the problem was bigger than they'd realized. He admitted that they'd been enabling Marcus's behavior by constantly bailing him out without asking questions. He said they needed to have a serious conversation about how to handle the situation going forward. Marcus, meanwhile, had completely disappeared from social media. His accounts were either deleted or locked down, and nobody had seen him since Friday. Some people were speculating that he'd left town, while others thought he might be in hiding from the people he owed money to. The viral post had accomplished exactly what I'd intended. It had forced everyone to confront the truth about Marcus that they'd been refusing to see. But the scale of the response was beyond anything I'd expected, and I was starting to realize that there might be no coming back from this for any of us. 2 weeks after the post went viral, my parents asked me to meet them for what they called they'd been getting calls from reporters, visits from people Marcus owed money to, and constant questions from friends and neighbors about the situation. We met at a family therapist's office, something my parents had never considered before, but which they now felt was necessary to deal with the aftermath of everything that had happened. The session was brutal but honest in a way our family had never been before. My parents admitted that they'd been aware Marcus was having problems, but had chosen to ignore the warning signs because it was easier than confronting the reality of who he'd become. My mom cried through most of the session, but she acknowledged that her constant financial support had enabled Marcus to continue his destructive behavior without facing consequences. My dad admitted that he'd been so invested in the idea of Marcus as the successful son that he'd refused to see evidence that contradicted that narrative. They also, for the first time in my life, acknowledged how their favoritism had affected me. My mom said she realized they'd taken me for granted because I was responsible and didn't cause problems, while they'd focused all their attention on Marcus because he demanded it. The therapist helped us work through some of the family dynamics that had led to this situation. She pointed out that my decision to go public with the information, while extreme, had been the result of years of feeling unheard and dismissed by my family. We also talked about Marcus, who still hadn't contacted any of us directly. Through mutual friends, we'd heard that he was staying with someone outside the city and was supposedly getting help for his addictions. But none of us knew if that was true or just another story. The hardest part of the session was when my parents asked me if I regretted posting everything publicly. I told them honestly that I regretted the pain it had caused them, but that I didn't regret exposing the truth. Marcus had been putting himself and potentially our family in danger, and nothing else had worked to get their attention. My dad said something that surprised me. He told me that while the method had been harsh, my post had probably saved Marcus's life. The people he owed money to were apparently serious about collecting their debts, and the public exposure had actually provided him with some protection by making his situation too visible for anyone to take violent action. We agreed to continue family therapy and to try to rebuild our relationships on a more honest foundation. My parents committed to treating me as an equal rather than the invisible child, and I agreed to try to repair our relationship despite the years of feeling overlooked. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was the first real conversation we'd ever had as a family about the problems that had been building for years. 6 months later, I was at a local business networking event when someone approached me and said they recognized me from I'd gotten used to being recognized occasionally, but this interaction was different. The person turned out to be a marketing director for a major local company. She told me that she'd been impressed by the thoroughness and professionalism of my research and documentation in the Marcus Files post. She said it had demonstrated exactly the kind of investigative and analytical skills they were looking for in their marketing department. Long story short, she offered me a job that was a significant step up from my previous position, with better pay and more responsibility. She specifically mentioned that my ability to compile and present complex information in a clear, compelling way was exactly what they needed for their market research team. It was surreal to realize that the worst thing I'd ever done to my family had actually advanced my career. But I'd learned that sometimes exposing the truth, even when it's painful, can lead to unexpected positive outcomes. Marcus, meanwhile, was living a much quieter life. He'd moved to a different city and was supposedly working in a warehouse while attending addiction recovery meetings. We'd had a few brief conversations over the phone, but our relationship was still strained. He'd never apologized for the years of lies or acknowledged the impact his behavior had on our family. But he also seemed to understand that the public exposure had been a wake-up call he'd needed, even if he resented me for being the one to provide it. My parents and I had continued with family therapy and had developed a much healthier relationship. They made an effort to show interest in my life and career, and I'd learned to communicate my needs more directly instead of letting resentment build up. The viral post was still occasionally referenced in local media when they did stories about social media and family dynamics. I'd become something of an accidental expert on the topic and had even been asked to speak at a few conferences about digital privacy and family relationships. Looking back, I still wasn't sure if going public had been the right choice, but I was certain it had been the only choice that would have forced everyone to confront the truth. Sometimes nuclear options are the only ones that work. Epilogue. So that's the story of how I destroyed my brother's life with one social media post and somehow ended up better off for it. It's been almost a year now, and people still occasionally recognize me or bring up the Marcus files when they find out who I am. My career has continued to flourish, partly because of the skills I demonstrated in that post, and partly because of the networking opportunities that came from the unexpected publicity. My relationship with my parents is the healthiest it's ever been, built on honesty instead of favoritism and denial. Marcus is doing better, from what I hear, though we still don't talk much. He's apparently been clean for several months and is slowly paying back some of the money he owed to legitimate creditors. His online presence is minimal now, and he seems to be living a much more authentic, if less glamorous, life. I learned that sometimes the most extreme action is the only one that creates real change. My family had been dysfunctional for years, but everyone was comfortable with the dysfunction because it was familiar. It took something dramatic to force us all to confront reality and make actual changes. Would I do it again? Honestly, I'm not sure. The nuclear option worked, but it came with costs that I'm still dealing with. Some family relationships were damaged beyond repair, and I'll always be known as the guy who destroyed his brother online. But I sleep better at night knowing that I told the truth when everyone else was content to live with lies.